Well, thank you very much. And I should also say that, give my Fed disclaimer that this research does not necessarily reflect the views of the Fed or the Federal Reserve System. It's my own and my co-authors' views. Although I probably shouldn't force them to take my same views, because who knows how they would present it. But anyway, this is joint work with Lauren Sartain and Marisa De La Torre, who are both at University of Chicago in the Consortium for Chicago School of Research. So I'm here today to talk about selective enrollment high schools in Chicago. And these are public high schools. They are, in general, they've been around in the US for more than 100 years in some locations. They are often ranked as the best public schools in their state and in the country by places like US News and World Report, which now ranks high schools. In Chicago, 4 of the top 5 high schools in Illinois are Chicago selective enrollment high schools, and 2 of these are ranked in the top 50 in the US. Parents are desperate to get their kids in. There's a blog called CPS Obsessed, where every year around this time, the letters are supposed to be mailed on tomorrow. People are just waiting, talking about whether their postman has come, or postal delivery person has come yet. Has anyone received their letters? Did they get in? What were the cutoffs? Things like that. And there are companies that promise to help make this happen. I pulled a couple of examples. This is one of them, and they talk about a mere 17% of applicants get in, and that this is even lower among some of the more desirable or popular schools. And this company actually said their results are guaranteed. Now, I don't know what they're guaranteeing. It is Chicago, so it's possible they can help you buy your way in. I don't know. I don't think there's too much of that going on. But in any case, parents are really concerned about getting their kids into these schools. So a question that has received interest in economics, certainly of late, is whether these highly selective schools matter. There's some recent work that many of you may have seen that suggested that many of the apparent advantages of attending these schools are due to selection. 2 primary examples are Adulkadiroglu, Angrist, and Paddock in Econometrica, and Dobbie and Fryer in the AEJ Applied, that find that there are no impacts on outcomes like test scores, college enrollment, and graduation, and that suggesting that the desire to go to these schools is really driven by the high levels of performance. But once you select kids on high performance, they continue to perform well. So my co-authors and I thought in Chicago there were a couple of interesting things. And one is that we think that parents don't necessarily choose schools based on test scores, and there might be other reasons that they would like to get their kids in the schools. They want access to peer networks, or maybe it has to do with extracurricular activities. And then the other interesting thing about Chicago is that their selection system is a bit different than other districts, in that they take into account some socioeconomic status. So I mentioned the Adulkadiroglu et al. Paper and Dobbie and Fryer. There are other works that have been done on high-performing schools. There's been other work in Chicago on, I'm drawing a blank on the author's name right now, but on the choice and whether getting a lottery admission to a magnet school, whether students do better, and they don't find that students have better outcomes. In this particular paper, what we're adding is that we can look for whether there are heterogeneous effects of being admitted to one of these selective enrollment high schools based on a measure of neighborhood poverty of the students' residents. And we also have a lot of survey data in Chicago about the students' experiences in high school. And so Today we're going to focus on some of these ninth grade outcomes that we can measure, including these survey outcomes of what students say about the environment of their school. This project is part of a broader set of questions that my co-authors and I are interested in, and we're trying to get some funding to pursue some of these questions. Today we're focusing mostly on do students from high poverty neighborhoods benefit from attending these selective enrollment high schools, and if so, in what ways? We're also interested in things like how do these criteria affect who applies and which applicants are admitted, to the extent that we can look at that through historical change in the application system over time, and thinking about how different criteria for assigning students to schools might affect student diversity in these schools in terms of socioeconomic status or race, and also how low-income parents and students navigate this application process. It seems a bit, as someone whose kids are not old enough to be applying for high school, it seems a bit like the college enrollment decision, but with a smaller set of schools to apply to. And I should also mention that the system came about because of a lifting of the consent decree that CPS was under to diversify schools. So instead of using race, they were using socioeconomic characteristics to try to maintain more integrated schools than they would have without any system, and yet not use race. So I'll tell you a little bit about the high school landscape in Chicago. There are a little over 110,000 high school students served by 174 high schools. Most of these are run by the district, including the 10, soon to be 11, selective enrollment high schools. 9 of the schools are contract high schools. Those are companies like AUSL come in to turn around a school, and 69 charter high schools. Of the high school students, 85% are eligible for free or reduced price lunch. About 16% are English language learners, and the racial makeup of students is about 44% Hispanic, 43% African American, and 8% white. And this is for the high school students. The schools are geographically spread out across the city. This is roughly the southern border of the city, and the school at the top is roughly at the northern border of the city. For anyone who knows Chicago at all, Hyde Park and University of Chicago are around in here. This is the Loop, the main downtown business section. So these schools are loosely the most centrally located in terms of transportation parts of the city. And obviously, if you live way down here, the time it would take you to get to this school is going to be high. I live somewhere in here, and on the train line that would service that school, and it would take my kids 50 minutes to get there. So, so these schools can be pretty spread out geographically. So in terms of admission criteria and why this study is sort of easy to implement, I guess, is that they use a point system. It's a 900-point application score based on grade 7 standardized tests, grade 7 GPA in math, English, science, and social studies, the core subjects, and a selective enrollment admissions exam. You can't take this exam unless you have high enough grade 7 ISAT scores. ISAT is the Illinois standard test that they gave up until this year. But the eligibility to take the selective enrollment exam is it's a pretty low bar. I think 50% of kids are eligible. I think it's a stay 9 of 5 on both the reading and math. And then the way the allocation of seats goes, it's a quota system where 30% of the slots at each school are allocated to the top performing students, And then the remaining 70% are equally among top scoring students within the by socioeconomic tier of their neighborhood. And like I mentioned, this was developed after lifting of the consent decree, and before that time, the quotas were based on race. There was a non-white share and a white share and a non-white share. So this is from the website where there's information about applying to these schools. And this is the scoring rubric so that you get points allocated. There are 300 points for the 7th grade assessments, half from reading, half from math. Grades are 75 points for an A, 50 for a B, 25 for a C, nothing for a D or F. And then the selective enrollment exam that similarly has points allocated with it. So it's pretty penalizing to get a B in 7th grade because it's equivalent to being like a 95th percentile kid in the test score. So that is, if you get 1 B, it's like dropping 5 percentiles in tests across the board. So how do they come up with these neighborhood tiers? So they use census and American Community Survey measures at the census tract level. And the measures they use are median family income, or estimated median family income, educational attainment, the percent of households that are single-parent households, the percent of homes that are owner-occupied, and the percent of the population speaking a language other than English. The first year they did this system, it was based on this 5-factor system of generating neighborhood tier. And then they added a 6-factor, which was the neighborhood elementary school achievement level. Basically, given where kids attend school, were these schools performing, what percent of students are meeting and exceeding standards kind of thing. And then they split the population. They create a score, a socioeconomic score from all these. They rank them, and then they assign the first tier to the point where they hit 25% of the school-age population, and then the next 25%. So 25% of the school-age population comes from each tier, and then tier 1 is the highest poverty, lowest education group. 4 is low poverty, high education. And so we can look at how different these tiers look. So this is based on the 2010 data. They actually publish all the data for you with your census tract and the numbers that go into calculating these things. And you see that like the median income in the high SES tier is about 3 times what it is in the lowest SES tier. All of the other things, this switches around a lot from year to year in terms of like how many kids are, on average, are living in each tier, and I'm not sure what that's driven by. But everything else sort of lines up the way you think. Like the low SES tier has high percentage of single-parent households compared to the high SES tier. Language isn't so correlated with tier. Percent owner-occupied homes, and this is the educational attainment score, which is basically it's going to range from 20 to 100, and it's 20 if everyone's a high school dropout, and 100 if everyone is has an advanced degree. So it's basically a weighted average of the percent of the population with different degrees, and then the school performance measure. So. Clearly they're different on income. You see a lot of people can't believe they live in a tier 4 neighborhood. I think the problem is people don't realize how far the right tail looks. So 25% of the population has to be in a tier 4 neighborhood, and that's a pretty big bin. Yeah.
Thinking about so there's weighting on students' grades. Like, do their teachers from their old school usually know if they're applying to a selective school? Would there be any manipulation of their grades?
Well, certainly I could imagine that I mean, the teachers know the kids are applying for high schools. So the elementary schools are all K-8. So the 7th graders in the school that have been there, you know, well, some of them have been there for 8 years, some of them haven't, but the teachers certainly know kids are going through it. I don't know, yeah, I'm sure the teachers feel pressure not to give grades. You definitely hear discussions about schools talking about having the A-B cutoff being 92% versus 90%, and trying to, you know, lobby the school to change that. Now, I would have thought grades were fungible enough that that really wouldn't make a difference. I don't know if it does or not. You also hear about people whose kids attend gifted elementary schools saying they, you know, their grades should, it's harder to get an A, so they should get more weight, but that they treat an A as an A regardless of the school. So, you know, yes, there could be some of this going on. We don't observe that everyone gets all A's in 7th grade, but it's certainly possible.
Do you see any differences by the tier?
I don't think so. I can't remember, and I don't have that on here, but I don't think you see grade differences by tier. I just can't remember right now. So this is what the tier map looks like of Chicago. Just to orient yourself, this was the downtown area, the loop where the more centrally located schools are. This is Hyde Park, where the University of Chicago. This is a golf course. I don't know why it's all red. Presumably no one lives in the golf course, but around the golf course, they're in red is for the lowest tier, and you know, this is, you know, the north side of the city. This swath is largely white. Black and Hispanic is more common in this part of the city. So, you know, it does sort of align with race. Yeah. So, as I mentioned, the way seats at the high schools get allocated are that this quota system of 30% of seats reserved for the highest scoring applicants, and the other 70% divided equally into the 4 neighborhood tiers. And so this is one of the more centrally located of the schools. This is actually right in the loop. It's called Jones, and they publish these numbers every year after they do the first round. And so this top group is the raw, or they have another term for it, I can't remember. In the data it says raw, but in the public documents they call it something else. So these are the students who were that were admitted based on points alone, and so the mean number of points is 891 out of 900. The minimum person that got in on score alone had 885 points, so better not get a B. And then the top was at 900. And so then you can see with the tiers that, so they're all the tiers, you know, the top is right at what the minimum was for the raw score, but the bottom admission for tier 1 students comes at 775 points compared to the tier 4 students at 875. So it does make it, well, in theory, it could make it easy. I don't know whether it's easier or harder to get in for tier 1, because maybe it's harder to score well given the schools you've attained, but it does change what that cutoff score, so that it's easier than if you used a simple ranking system and said no one below 875 points would be admitted to the school. This is again, I mentioned this was publicly available data that is on the website, and this is some of the characteristics of this high school, that they have an average ACT of 26.6, so it's above average. It's not, you know, a perfect score. Graduation rate of 90%, college enrollment rate of 89% among graduates, and a persistence rate of 88%, which means that they show up a year after they first enroll in college. So, so how do the seats get allocated? So applicants are asked to rank up to 6 of the schools. There are 10. So So there is an incentive for students to be a little bit strategic if their scores are not that great. The district ranks the students by application score. I said it was deferred acceptance. I think it's actually called serial dictatorship, because there is the schools aren't ranking the students any different. So there's no strategic decision on the part of the schools. The students are all ranked by test score, or not test score, application score. And so you sort all the students so that the top scoring student gets their first choice. They get allocated to their first ranked school for which they qualify. And then you move your way down to the next ranked students. So a student that ranks a school higher will never get in above a student who has a higher score. So you don't, if I rank Walter Payton #1 and Whitney Young #2, I won't miss out on admission to Whitney Young because I didn't rank it #1, as long as my score is high enough to qualify. So, so they do this to fill all the slots. They fill the raw slots first, followed by the tier slots. And the schools are required to maintain a minimum percentage of special education or IEP students. So this is sort of a separate process. They have to be within 5 percentage points of that district average. So they work on filling those slots in a separate system. From parents' perspective, it looks identical unless you have a kid who has what do they call it? A low incidence IEP, so deaf or blind. They have cluster programs at the school, but generally speaking, as a parent, it looks the same, but the cutoff scores don't apply to the IEP students, so we drop them from the analysis. So the analytic sample that we're going to look at today are these cohorts of selective enrollment applicants who are entering 9th grade from fall 2010 through fall 2013. We're going to limit these to students who attended CPS in both 8th and 9th grade. We have interest in thinking about entry and exit from CPS, but for now we're limiting it to the kids we can follow. And we're going to drop the IEP students. Okay, so this table, every column is a different sample, and so you would read down the column of the characteristics of the first column being all non-applicants, and the second column is all applicants. So you can see, almost 50% of the students are applying to a selective enrollment high school. The applicants are less likely to be Black and more likely to be white and Asian. It's also true that the selective enrollment high schools they're a girl thing. I don't know if that, we knew that going in based on the students that are there. I didn't know that the applications also look like this. I don't know how much of this is driven by who's actually eligible to apply based on test scores. There is no grade thing for eligibility, so it isn't driven by grades. So there are kids that take the test who could not possibly get in because they have no points from the grades, and test scores alone, even if you have perfect tests, won't get you in. So, and the applicants are more advantaged in somewhat less likely to be eligible for free or reduced price lunch. These are a grade 8 test score that's actually after they apply. They're less likely to attend their assigned elementary school. So there's a minimum point threshold of 650 points, and only 41% of the applicants, and these are people who completed their application, took the test, only 41% are eligible based on that minimum point requirement. And of those, 30% of all applicants are admitted to a selective enrollment school, and 23% of these applicants are actually enrolled in a selective enrollment school in grade 9. And this is conditional on still being in CPS. So some students opt for other schools. Admitted students obviously are all admitted. They're very likely to have been eligible based on points. There is a principal discretion. There are ways that people that didn't make the 650 points might get enrolled, and the admitted students are less diverse than the applicants. There's a lower percentage of Black and Hispanic students, higher percentage of white and Asian students than among the applicants, and the girls are more likely to be admitted than the boys. They're also, generally more advantaged in terms of just the free lunch eligibility. This takes the applicants and splits them out by the tiers. So, it's clear that the tiers have some difference in terms of the racial makeup in the city, and the free and reduced price lunch eligibility. They don't look that different across the test score base. This is a grade 8 test score. But the higher tier students are more likely to attend their neighborhood school, probably because they live in a neighborhood that has a pretty high-performing neighborhood school. And the Tier 4 applicants are more likely to be eligible based on their meeting that 650 threshold. So among Tier 1 applicants, conditional on meeting that minimum threshold, there's a pretty high probability of being admitted, something like 85%. It's still pretty high among Tier 4 applicants, but it's not nearly as high. And across tiers 1 through 3, about roughly 20% of the kids enroll in a selective in 9th grade, and about 30% in Tier 4. So, and the number of applicants coming from each tier is pretty similar, given that the tiers are supposed to be representative of the school-age population, although tiers 2 and 3 are more likely. I mean, they have higher numbers of applicants than 1 and 4. Then this is doing the same thing of characterizing the schools. So these are the 10 schools, and this is saying what do the applicant characteristics look like based on individuals who indicated that school was their first choice. So here you can see that there are differences, not surprising given both the segregation of Chicago and the geographic dispersion of the schools, that the applicants indicating a first choice school look pretty different. So the schools that I mentioned were pretty centrally located are Jones, Peyton, and Young, and just looking at race, they have a much more, they look much more like the overall applicant pool in terms of their breakdown. Whereas, so Brooks and King are on the far south side of the city, have very high percentage of African American applicants. Lane is on the north side. It's got a very low percentage of African American applicants, as is North Side, which was the one way up on the top. And again, South Shore was way on the south side. So there are these differences in the concern that has developed post this system about some of the schools becoming whiter. In some sense, it's not surprising because the city is segregated and the schools are geographically diverse, so it's not surprising to me that applicants to these schools are related to where they're located.
Are the schools
Really that big? 12,000? Oh, no, these are applicants. So 7,000 students said that Young was their first choice. 12,000 students said that Lane was their first choice. Lane is a relatively large high school, but it's not 12,000 students. So, okay. All right, so this is what the distribution of application scores look like for each of the schools. And these have been normalized, so 0 is the cutoff in every year. So every year the cutoff is going to be slightly different for different tiers and different schools. And so these have all been centered around 0. And, ideally you would see, this would be a perfectly continuous measure and we wouldn't see any bunching around the cutoff. The fact is it's not a truly continuous measure. You cannot get a score of 899. It's not possible the way the points are allocated. So when at some of the highest cutoff schools, you see some bunching at the top. And so if we can throw out the tier 4 students, and that predominantly goes away. So that it's like it's like a top coding type problem. That there are only so many point combinations above 885. So between 885 and 900. So we think it looks pretty good in terms of manipulation around the cut score. Then this is what the offer rates look like. So the way the system works, students only get an offer for one school, except for there is an appeal process after the initial assignment that you can appeal to be admitted, and the principals can admit up to, I think it's 5% of students based on what they call principal discretion. So then there's a whole lobbying period that goes on. But you kind of see this standard pattern at a school like Lindblom where the offer rate is highest right at the cut point and then tails off because students that are scoring up here may be getting an offer from a school they ranked more highly. So that's a common pattern. And these schools, schools like Northside and Peyton, where the cutoffs are really high up the distribution, you don't see that pattern so much. And then South Shore is a brand new school, and there's only 1 year of, brand new is a selective enrollment, there's only 1 year of application data in here. So it's a little bit noisier in terms of everything. And so then if we looked at the enrollment rate, South Shore looks really strange. And then it's part because they have a non-selective program at the same school that right now we can't distinguish between being enrolled in the selective program and being enrolled in the career and technical education program. But in general, so it's not a perfect mapping. Not everyone takes up. Yeah.
Just to think through some of the issues right on the distance, do they over-admit knowing what their yield is likely going to be, or do they admit and then bring in a second wave as soon as the first projections come and just keep moving down discontinuity?
So they know they don't do second rounds. They make a first round offer based on, they basically know, they plan on a certain percentage, a certain yield rate. So they don't go back and make second round offers in that sense. The only kind of second round offers that occur are this principal discretion where students make appeals. Usually what happens is a student didn't get into their first choice school. They would really like to go to their first choice school. They put together a case. They get recommendation letters from their principal, things like that. But there was a scandal around principal discretion in Chicago where, they called it clouding in your children. And Governor Rauner, the current governor, his daughter went to Walter Payton, and they didn't even live in the city, and he had to get her she qualified in the sense of having a high score, but not high enough to get in. And so there was lots of scandal about this. So now, if a principal wants to accept a student, they have to make a case to a committee. So it's more transparent. It's still lobbying's going on for the principal to want to admit the student, but the principal has to make a case for why this is a good admit. So they don't sort of continue down the discontinuity in that sense. Okay, so one of the questions is, what is the counterfactual for if you don't get into one of these selective enrollment high schools, what does that mean for where you're going to high school? And so this table takes the applicants and looks at where they actually go, where they actually enroll in high school, and averages the high school characteristics, the characteristics of the high school by the applicants. So it's essentially weighted by the number of applicants that ended up at that school. And so, once again, like students who are admitted to a selective enrollment high school are going to schools, they end up at schools with higher % female, which isn't surprising given that the selective enrollment schools are higher % female. They're more white, less Hispanic, somewhat less black, somewhat more Asian. Essentially, this is 7.6%. That's like what the law says they have to have. And the schools are larger on average than the high schools that people who don't get admitted to. And then in terms of ACT scores, those who are admitted to a selective enrollment high school go to a high school with an average score of about 23, which is something in the 68th percentile of the individual distribution, versus a score of around 18, which is somewhere more like 30%. So there is a difference in the schools attended by those not selective. And then this table, I did the same thing, but showed you the difference for applicants from Tier 4 and applicants for Tier 1. And there's some of these characteristics that I think are less different. So if you look at the Tier 4 kids, there's the schools that they're going to instead, in terms of like racial makeup, are not quite as different, like on % white, as the Tier 1 kids. Some of the other characteristics are much more similar across the two in terms of average ACT scores. The difference between those selected versus not, whether it's Tier 4 or Tier 1, are pretty similar. So the estimation strategy, if you hadn't already guessed, is our regression discontinuity design. And so what we're doing is we're stacking the data. We center the application score around the cutoff within school, tier, and cohort. So every year they publish what these cutoffs are. Every year they're slightly different because they're going to depend on what the most popular school was to apply to rank first that year, how well people scored. This year, the big mystery this year is they have a different test. So they don't know quite how, not the selective enrollment test, but the state test, it's called the NWEA. They stopped giving the ISAT in anticipation of switching to the PARC, and so they have to use a different test in the interim. And so they don't know exactly where the cutoff scores are, but they published their best guess of where they would have been. So anyway, there's a shifting over time. And we're going to control for a quadratic in the centered application score. And we're going to, for the purposes of today, I'm just going to show you results that limit the estimation sample. So these are going to be all parametric estimates. Limit the estimation sample to those who have application scores within a half a standard deviation of the cutoff. Students who are admitted to a selective enrollment high school only are going to appear in the data once as part of the treatment group. Students who are not admitted to any selective high school appear in the data potentially multiple times as part of the control group. So if they rank 2 schools, which they were close to the cutoff in both of those but didn't make it, then they would be in there twice. And I'm going to show you some reduced form in IV, mostly IV estimates, but I'll show both of them. And then just a few pictures to look at sort of baseline characteristics. This is binned data to look at the proportion Hispanic, and this is also limited to within a half a standard deviation of the cut score. And so, yes, there is this sort of tendency to of a like decline in percent Hispanic with the centered application score, but there isn't a statistically significant break at the cut score. This is the grade 8 test, so this comes after. This isn't actually even part of the application. It's the spring after the students are already admitted, and this very clearly, shows no sort of break at the cut score. And then this is the first 9th grade outcome I'll show you graphically, and this is the standardized test score. And once again, like, you select students that are high performing on test scores, and you get students who perform highly on test scores. And this is consistent with the research out of Boston and New York City. This is unweighted grade 9 GPA. And here, we do see this, significantly lower GPA among students who just get admitted relative to students who just miss it, which isn't surprising if you think, GPA is sort of a distribution, and either you're just admitted and you're going to be at the bottom of your peers in the distribution, or you just missed it and you're going to be the best student in your school where you end up. And then this is just an example of one of the survey measures that I'm going to show you some tables of regression results, and this is a peer support measure about my classmates, or what, and I will show you the details of what the questions are about. But this is pretty typical of when we see a result in the survey measures. It has this sort of like upward sloping piece on the left-hand side if I looked at all the graphs, and a sort of horizontal slope on the right-hand side. So, okay, so here's some actual tables. The tables are going to have the same structure, where essentially each element in the table is a separate regression, with the top element being what the outcome mean is for the sample, and what's differing on the rows is what is the sample in which the estimation is done. And so this was the standardized test score I showed you the picture of that, pretty much looked like a line through the cut score, and so the point estimate is 5 standard deviations, -5 standard deviations, but it's not statistically different from 0. Then we say, well, look at the bottom 3 tiers, and then look at like each of the tiers separately, and we see no indication of any test score effect across the boundary. And this is what is consistent with what the both the Boston and New York City folks found in their studies. So this is the same column I just showed you. Then this is the unweighted GPA result. So in the OLS estimates, all tiers, the students have roughly, these are in grade points, so 0.22 lower GPAs than students who just fail to get admitted. And it's monotonically, this impact is monotonically decreasing with socioeconomic tier. So it's a bigger GPA hit for tier 1 kids. There's no difference in the probability that you take an honors course. So these selective enrollment high schools, basically everything's supposed to be an honors course, but that the kids not going to them seem to be taking honors courses at the same rate. Maybe there's a small impact on attendance, and it would seem to be potentially bigger among the lower tier kids than the upper tier kids. A small reduction in the probability of being assigned an in-school suspension. Again, looks like it might be bigger in the lower tier kids than the kids up here, but not obvious that there's any difference. And no difference in the probability of being assigned an out-of-school suspension. This is all administrative data. And then last, we looked at whether whether you stick around, whether you're enrolled in CPS again in grade 10, there's no impact on that. And whether you're enrolled on time. So does it say when we expect you to be enrolled in grade 10, does it say you're in grade 10 or does it say you're in grade 9? And there doesn't seem to be any impact on that. So then, as I showed you, there is this slack in take-up because not everyone gets admitted. So this is the IV versions of those equations. And so when you look at the GPA effect, it's almost half a grade point lower in terms of the hit that students are taking on GPA, and it's more than half a point for Tier 1 students and more like 0.4 for Tier 4 students. So there, it does seem to be this GPA effect. Again, the attendance and in-school suspension effects look like they could be bigger for the lower tier kids than the higher tier kids. And nothing on whether you persist or are enrolled in grade 10 on time. So then we have the survey data. This is student survey data, and I did not name these categories. They use the survey data, parts of these survey data, in what are called the 5 essentials that go into how schools are ranked in Chicago. Not all of these survey measures are used. Some of them are and some of them aren't. And I could not tell you right now which ones are and which ones aren't. But they are all kind of structured like this and ask questions. So course clarity, how much do you agree with? And these are 4-point Likert type scales. So strongly disagree, disagree, agree, strongly agree kind of version. For the agree, in how often, it's the same thing, but it's a scale of something about how often. So course clarity, you know what you need to do to get a good grade. You get a lot of feedback about your work. Homework is useful for learning the course material. Engagement is, I look forward to this class. So this is specific to a target class they're asking about. It's really interesting, I'm engaged kind of question. Press is about, sort of course difficulty. I'm challenged. I have to work hard to do well. The class really makes me think, stuff like that. Also on academic experience, there's study habits. I set aside time to do my homework. I always study for tests. And grit, I finish whatever I begin. I'm a hard worker. I don't give up easily. There are questions that have to do with the future. I believe that grades in high school matter for success in college. I'm learning valuable skills. Working hard matters for success in the workplace. And then also more about like the school's focus on the future. Teachers make sure that all students are planning for life after graduation. Teachers work hard to make sure that all students are learning. High school is seen as preparation for the future. All students are encouraged to go to college, that kind of thing. Then there are what we grouped as relationship questions. So peer support, I showed you a picture of this one. Students in my school, like to put others down, help each other learn, don't get along very well, treat others with respect. Things like this are all scaled, so they're moving in the same direction. Classroom personalism, the teacher helps me catch up if I'm behind, notices if I have trouble learning something. So it's sort of about the teacher relationship that you have. Then another one about that gets called teacher-student trust. My teachers really care about me. I feel safe and comfortable with my teachers at school. The teachers try to be fair. They treat me with respect. And then the last category are about feelings of safety. So general school safety, outside and around the school, I feel safe. Traveling between home and school, I feel safe. In my classes, I feel safe. In the hallways and bathrooms. And then this gets called personal safety, but it's really, we think about it as like the bullying measure. Like students at the school are often teased or picked on. Students at the school are often threatened or bullied. I worry about crime and violence in the school. So these survey measures are from the spring of the 9th grade school year. The good news is that response rates are pretty high. So this is just the IV estimates of, does the student have survey responses? And so, 80%, almost 80% of students have survey responses, and it doesn't seem to differ across the cut threshold. Maybe tier 1 students are more likely to respond if they get in, but not significantly. Okay, so this is the first group about academic experience, and so basically, overall, none of these show statistically significant differences for kids who are just getting into the selective enrollment schools versus not. There are no statistical differences, just limited to the tier 1 to 3 kids. So you might think that we went in thinking these schools might matter more for kids from the most disadvantaged neighborhoods, and we're not seeing that, based on the bottom 3 quarters. Maybe if we get down there, there are actually, bigger positive impacts for tier 4 kids, if anything. These next 2 columns were about the future orientation of the school. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'm trying to think about splitting up by tiers, because it seems like many more of the tier 4 students were going to be at the very top of the initial ranking and sort of would have gotten into their first choice school, as opposed to being seats or students that got in because they're part of the mandatory 25%, 25%, 25%.
That is true.
And so I wonder if there's some sort of conflating of being in different tiers versus also being a student that basically definitely got their first choice in school, and how that might.
So the kids who get in at the top, like the raw admit people, they're going to be they're going to be less likely to be in the sample, right? Because they're going to be more than a half standard deviation above the cut score, depending on. I mean, obviously it depends on the cut score, but
even with the sliding cut score,
yeah. So, but that is a good question, and I don't know the answer of how many are falling in that group in this sample. I just haven't looked at it. So, this importance of high school for the future. So the schools themselves, there's no evidence that overall that they seem to be more future oriented, but kids' perceptions of the importance of high school for their future does seem to be higher among the kids that just get selected for the selective enrollment high schools. But but interestingly, it's not about the tier 1 kids. It is, it does seem to be more of a higher tier effect.
One of the things I'm still trying to understand is what's the potential mechanisms that we're really thinking about here?
So this.
Kind of reduced form at the discontinuity, but do you think that the big effect is going to be a peer effect, or do you think it's going to be a productive nature of the schools, that there's something different about the production function?
Well, okay, so this is this is part of the question that I'm trying to answer, right? I think that in many ways, it looks like you select a bunch of kids based on high performance and you get a bunch of high performing kids. Now, but there do seem to be differences in the experiences of the kids at the schools that may differ by, so we have heard that there are some, like, that tier 1 kids may be treated differently in this, like that there's in some schools that maybe there's a view that, oh, these are the quota kids, that kind of.
These look very different from like the METCO results. And in the METCO results, there were just a small number, so it was kind of hard to form a big peer group, whereas here it's 15 to 20% of the student body is made up of kids in that same group. And,
Yeah.
I wonder, going back to like the Carroll and Sacerdote stuff, and one of the things that they were finding was that the peer effects became less salient when the groups were big enough to where they could sort within the peer. And so in their kind of squadron, they were getting these groupings of the low ability kids all together.
Right.
Almost as a subgroup. And I wonder if that's kind of the mechanism, what's going on here to kind of make it to where it's not being a productive mechanism, if the mechanism is peers.
Yeah. Well, and this is one of the things that we're interested in looking at is whether, does this sort of persist? Is this so to the extent that if I'm a tier 4 student, and I get selected for a selective enrollment high school, there are quite a few peers that look a lot like me, versus maybe for the tier 1 kids, it's a really different, it's much more different. I mean, we know, what we didn't do, which actually is something we're interested in, is the, how, so I showed you how the high school experience differed, based on where they end up. And it looked on some dimensions like the differences were smaller for the tier 4 students than the tier 1 students. But you could imagine that they might look even more different if we looked at what did their 8th grade cohort look like compared to where they end up in high school. And maybe if you're coming from a school that looks more like your high school, like that there's some of that. So maybe by 10th grade, maybe some of these things change so that once I've acclimated or something to the high school, that my views on my peers or my teachers or my experience look more similar. I don't know. But I think this is one of the questions is there anything really about the schools, or is it just about, I take good kids, I have a good set of peers, and so, my cynical view is that Mayor of Chicago does something like this because he wants to be able to say that we have the best public high school in the state. But that's in the most cynical days, that's my view of it. So this is these were what we called relationship measures, and here we seem to see more, like in terms of viewing the peers as supportive and the teachers as supportive, like in terms of an overall thing. But once again, this isn't about what the tier 1 kids are experiencing, reporting so much as what's coming out in the higher tier students. And then the last grouping on this is about the safety, and this is the, how safe do you feel, like between school and home, around the school, and there's nothing here except for maybe the tier 4 kids, which is somewhat surprising given some of the things we hear about safety and violence in Chicago, but it is what it is. But on the bullying measure, this is more clearly, like, throughout the tiers, seems to be that students are reporting, a less that students are less likely to be bullied in their school. So in a sense, this could be put with the peer support. Like it's consistent with this in terms of like the views of the peers in the school and the supportiveness of the environment. Okay, so you guys are really quiet. So in terms of the conclusions we're having so far is that is very consistent with what was found in New York City and Boston in terms of attending a selective enrollment high school in 9th grade has no impact on test scores. It does lower GPA by half a grade point. So that's sort of a, for us, it's been an interesting trade-off to think of, like, does that matter in terms of applying to high school? I mean, applying to college, because you might think that that there is no distinct, like, I'm not sure whether a college admissions person draws any distinction between a GPA from a selective enrollment high school in Chicago versus a non-selective enrollment high school. So this could, potentially be a cost that students are trading off or parents are trading off for their kids. It possibly raises attendance rates and lowers the probability of an in-school suspension for the bottom tier kids. And like I said, these results are broadly consistent with the New York City and Boston results. In terms of more of the survey data, they're suggestive of students experiencing a better learning environment in terms of greater peer support, higher teacher-student trust, more personal safety, which is really about peer support. Those, I think I combined them in the statement I sent describing the research. But I think it's notable that the peer support and teacher-student trust don't seem to have the same impacts for Tier 1 kids. So in the end, at this point, I conclude that there's generally no systematically greater impacts for students from more disadvantaged neighborhoods, which was sort of the hypothesis that we went in with, thinking that, oh, sure, kids who come from advantaged backgrounds are going to be fine wherever they go. So I can imagine it's not going to matter, but maybe for these kids that from more disadvantaged backgrounds, maybe it would make a bigger difference, and it's not clear that it does. And finally, in terms of thinking about the future of this, so obviously we're interested in looking at some longer term outcomes, and one of the problems is kids take 4 years to get through 4 years of high school, so we can't, we don't have anybody graduating yet. But we can get at some measures, like we should be able to look at ACT scores for at least 3 cohorts of students and GPA for, grade 10 and things like that. And also I mentioned this is part of a larger project where, there's some hope to do some qualitative work on how families navigate the high school application process. This is not, I wouldn't be the lead person on this. It would not be my strength, but there's some interest in understanding this better, and CPS has interest in understanding some of these things better. And also thinking about, like, the big issue, one of the big issues in Chicago has been about race and how the racial makeup or diversity of these schools has changed with the lifting of the consent decree. And so thinking about how different, obviously you have to assume that students wouldn't change their ranking, but how different allocation systems might affect the makeup of students in these schools. Thank you.